Welcome here. So just take a moment to settle in. It would be lovely to see some of you, so please do turn on your webcams if you can. Hello, Devon. Hello, Barbara. Hello, Wally and Wendy, Tina, Lena. Welcome, welcome. Good to have you here. We're going to make today quite interactive, and I'm going to start right at the beginning. Before we jump into the interactive part, let me welcome you to this webinar in our Transforming Organizations Hub. I'm Jessica Bockler, one of the co-founding directors of the Alef Trust, and we have with us today Sophie Maclaren, who has wonderful expertise and a very rich background, both in meditation and in working in business. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sophie before I hand over to her. But before I even do that, I also want to do a short transitional practice with you to invite you into a more centered, more grounded, more embodied state of being. So why don't we start with that now? And then I'll give Sophie her introduction. And then we will take it from there. And she'll take us on a journey into human flourishing and its relevance for organizations. So you might want to just adjust your posture. Notice how you're sitting. And we're just going to enter into a short transitional pause. And you might want to lower your eyelids, close your eyes if you're comfortable with that. Or otherwise, look at something that you find visually pleasing, something beautiful. And then I invite you to inhabit your feet, coming home to yourself. And notice what you can feel inside your feet. Maybe you can feel the connection that you have with the ground right now through the soles of your feet. And as you're beginning to inhabit your feet more fully, feel free to make small adjustments, connecting more deeply to the ground. And notice too where else in your body you might want to make some small adjustments to feel a little more grounded, a little more relaxed, a little more open, expansive. Very gently coming home to yourself. Softening into the ground of being. And no matter where we're touching into our embodied experience, every part is a portal to the whole. We can feel into our feet, and we can feel the whole of ourselves. So I invite you to feel more deeply and inhabit your feet more fully, connecting to the ground and coming home to the fullness of your being. And then from there, you can softly open your eyes if you had them closed. And just take a look around the room, notice who is here. And again, welcome. So we're going to go on a journey with Sophie. Sophie is a fellow at the Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship at the Said Business School, that's at the University of Oxford. And her work explores how the practice of human flourishing, when it's applied to leadership, can lead to organizational flourishing, where the organization meets its objectives and the workforce feels purposeful and enriched and energized. And Sophie has long-standing experience in Tibetan lineages that are specialized in enlightened leadership. And Sophie draws on that experience, which she has lived for a long, long time, since her childhood, and from her experience in modern science, weaving together those two fields and those two bodies of knowledge. So it's fantastic to have you here, Sophie, and to bring this long-standing experience that you have, integrating these two areas through a lot of work that you have done, both at the university, but also in private consulting, in the business sector, and also in facilitating retreats. So I think we're in for a treat. Thank you very much for being here with us, and I'll hand over to you.
Jessica, thank you so much for having me. And it's really a delight to be here with all of you. I'm curious about who's in the room and what is interesting and helpful to you. I've, of course, planned a presentation, but, we can talk about whatever we like whilst we're here. And I'd like it to be something that's relevant and helpful to you. So I wonder if you don't mind writing in the chat, or if you want to put on your microphone and just share who you are, what country you're in, maybe what you're working on. Or if there's anything that is particularly interesting to you in this topic. And you might have no requests. You might think, I don't even know what human flourishing means, and that's fine too. But if you did come hoping for something, then please let me know so that we can cover that too.
Sophie, if I may, I'll unmute.
Thank you.
I've been busy at my keyboard all day. Don't feel like typing anymore.
Wonderful.
It's a real pleasure to meet you and to be in this space. And I'm of great interest in terms of your background and how your interest in meditation stemming from your childhood feeds into your practice, your personal practice, but also your professional practice these days. That's one curiosity of mine. But in regards to the topic of flourishing, I'm also interested in hearing from you about what are the obstacles or hindrances that prevent the potential of flourishing in organizations specifically. And if there are hindrances that can be identified, how might we approach them, perhaps even overcome them if that is something worth pursuing?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good questions. Thanks. Just writing it down. Okay. And I don't see anything in the chat, but maybe I can't see the chat. Am I missing something? Barbara.
Yeah, hi everyone, and hi Sophie. Thank you for this.
Hello.
Yeah, I just wanted to share just very briefly that I have been in pretty senior leadership positions used to work in the oil business, and after a couple of mountain bike accidents, I was introduced to breathing by an Ayurvedic practitioner where I lived in the Middle East. And it completely changed my life, and how I showed up in my leadership role was very, very different. You know, in that position, you know, I'd done all this leadership development, been sent to INSEAD for this and that. Nothing changed me the way breathing changed me. And then, like you said in your introduction, then, you know, when you change how you interact and you get that more connection, then the results naturally follow. And, you know, so rather than focus on, you know, business results, focus on these kind of connections with people. And then, you know, people are more motivated. There's so much, you know, less absenteeism, and, you know, people are, you're not this like person that people are, you know, scared to come and ask for advice and so on. So yeah, and I'm just, you know, I quit all that world. I've done quite a lot of research in the neuroscience and so on. And yeah, I just really interested to connect with people on this, and, you know, see how we can all support each other, collaborate, and, you know, make an impact and have more love.
Yes. Thank you, Barbara. And please, you know, and this is for everyone, feel welcome if you want to share personal experience as we go along. I think in a moment we'll talk a little bit about the neuroscience, and I'll explain why your experience of finding that actually working with the breath was more transformative or beneficial to you than even, you know, these great programs that they have at INSEAD, which is a great university.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Why that is. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Anyone else want to share? Okay, Wendy's from South Africa. And her interests are global education, human development, multimodal film, literacy, transpersonal leadership, and looking forward to hearing more about the neuroscience. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. And Wally from New York City, working in the nonprofit and philanthropy space, and curious about how organizations can promote a culture of caring, empathy, and mutual empowerment. Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? And you don't have to share, but okay. All right. So that's very helpful. Thank you. And I've made some notes, and I'll try to cover all of the things that have been mentioned. And if I don't cover something, please don't feel shy to flag me and or ask a question. And again, this will be an interactive session. So if something is confusing, or also if you disagree, you know, feel welcome to challenge things. I lecture at a university. I'm very used to everything I say being thoroughly challenged and ripped to shreds. So don't feel shy if you disagree with something or if something's confusing. Okay, let's dive in. So I made just a few slides just to help us stay on track. Let me just make sure I can share them properly. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, can you now see my slides?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
All right, great. We're off to a good start. Okay, and I'm going to make you a bit bigger because I would rather see you all than my slides. There we go. Okay, so we're talking today, of course, about you know, the title was conscious leadership, and then looking at the science of human flourishing, which underpins, I believe, organizational flourishing. And I'm not going to talk too much about that underpinning, because I think that point has been made so thoroughly. And I don't think we really need to be convinced of that. And if you still need to be convinced, I recommend the work of my colleague at Saïd Business School, Yann Emmanuel Deneuve, who's done some really interesting work, and he actually started a well-being research center here at Oxford, or Professor Lord Richard Layard at the LSE has written quite a bit on this. So there's a lot out there. But, essentially, it's fairly clear that as organizations are made up of human beings, if the organization is to flourish, the human beings need to flourish. And I think too often, and we've found this, and Barbara, you probably had experience with this, too often we tend to think that organizational flourishing justifies or even requires sort of draining human beings, and that we have to sacrifice human flourishing for organizational flourishing. But really, the science is fairly clear that any investment in human flourishing is an investment in organizational flourishing. So again, I don't think we need to make that point too much, but I will say, for myself, as Jessica said, my focus is on human flourishing, and I look at the science of that. And really what I'm interested in is, how do human beings live their best lives in their unique context? And since, as you've probably noticed in your own lives, most of us spend most of our waking hours and most of our living years. Have you noticed where you spend most of your time? Exactly. Here at work, on your screen, right? I think let's start there. How do we flourish in our working life? Because the reality is that we happen to live in a time where our working life really is our life, right? It's the majority of our waking hours. It's the majority of our sort of best years of our life. So if we sort of say, how do we flourish despite our working life? That's probably not going to work so well for us in the bigger picture. So how can our working life actually become the part of our life that inspires us, that gives us meaning and purpose, that energizes us, that makes us feel fulfilled, that we develop ourselves? And so that's primarily what my work looks at. And so let's look a little bit at what human flourishing means. So I have to tell you, it took me years to come up with this term, human flourishing. I obviously didn't invent it, but it took me a long time to work out what is the language for what are we talking about, this state of being? Because I grew up with Tibetan Buddhism, and I practiced meditation from when I was a small child. And in my teens and 20s, I actually taught full time in those traditions. I grew up with traditions of leading people towards enlightenment or awakenment, and that language doesn't really work so well in business. Right? It sounds a little bit too woo-woo, but I think human flourishing captures this sense that it's you at your best, and in all the dimensions of yourself. So mentally, physically, emotionally, but also spiritually, socially. So it means that essentially you are in harmony with yourself, and you're also in harmony with the wider world. You're in good relationships with people and with the world around you. And when we're really flourishing, there's a quality of stability to that. So there's this sort of unwavering sense of balance and alignment. And so a lot of the practices that we do in many different traditions are about cultivating our flourishing in these different dimensions, and also cultivating a stability with it. And sometimes we talk about that nowadays, especially in business, as resilience. But really it's this sense that we're balanced and we can hold that. Even in the midst of a storm, we can, ride the waves and that sort of thing. So what is the link with human flourishing and conscious leadership? Is that essentially, if we want to create organizations or ecosystems of human flourishing, it requires a consciousness of leadership to accomplish that. So we need conscious leaders. It's something, it doesn't sort of happen accidentally, right? We need to be quite conscious in the way that we're leading to create those aspects. And as well, the foundation for conscious leadership is these aspects that we just mentioned. We need to be in balance to be able to lead consciously. And good leadership requires an internal balance. And so if we look at the research on, high-performing leaders and the capacities of high-performing leaders today, what we find is that a lot of these capacities are underpinned by practices and abilities to be balanced in our mind, in our heart, in our body, and our nervous system. So, for example, a conscious leader is first and foremost aware. They're not on autopilot. Most of the time we function on autopilot, and that's all right. It saves a lot of energy for the brain. But if we're leading consciously, we have to be off autopilot. We have to have both a broad awareness, an ability to see the big picture, but also an ability to zoom in and maintain focus on the smaller details. We need an ability to think both short term, and especially, and what tends to be missing nowadays is to think very long term. We need to be able to hold complexity. We need to be comfortable with a certain degree of uncertainty, which will always be a part of life, but which seems to be a challenge more and more for business leaders. We need to be emotionally intelligent. We need to be able to create trusting spaces where people can be collaborative. We need to be good communicators, and so on. And all of these capacities are underpinned in some way by us knowing how to work with and be in balance in our mind, body, and heart. Are you with me so far with this? Does it make sense? Yeah. Okay. Okay, good. So, and this is now a question for you. And with every leadership, so I work primarily with senior leadership teams in business, mostly global businesses, and then also senior leaders in government, policymakers. And I always begin by asking them, what do you do to nourish yourself? What do you do to regain your energy, to clear your head? Because we're working in a knowledge economy. And Barbara, you'll know this very much from your experience and work. In a knowledge economy, what is your greatest asset? I see people typing. Essentially, it's right, your mind, right? Your ability to think clearly. And Jessica wrote that in the chat as well. Yeah. And so with leaders, I always ask them, okay, so this is your greatest asset. With my MBA students, I ask them to work out the value of their mind, therefore. So they have to find a dollar amount. What is their mind worth to them if they were to insure it? And they have all their ways of working that out. But essentially what we find is, this is the most valuable asset that I have, right? If there's anything that you have that you definitely don't want to lose, it's your mind, right? So then we say, okay, so if it's that valuable, if you were to invest that amount of money, let's say in a new business or a property, how much time would you spend researching that investment? How does this thing work well? What can potentially go wrong? And so on. And so with that, I think it's important for all of us, whether we're in a leadership position or not, to really have a sense, this is my mind. How does it function well? And we happen to live in a time where there are a lot of challenges to our mind, where we're highly stimulated, we process huge amounts of data, and we'll talk about that more, which means that all of us have something that we're doing to take care of our mind. We might call it a mindfulness practice. We might call it something else. We might not have any name for it. But with leaders, I always say you could not be in the position you're in if you weren't doing something to manage your mind. So what are the things that you do? I'm curious to hear. And you can turn on your microphone. You can write in the chat. And Jessica also wrote, so many other assets that are undervalued, like the heart. Yes, thank you, Jessica. And I should say, because I also grew up with, Tibetan traditions, mind and heart are not separate in those traditions. And I should say that when I'm talking about mind, I'm equally talking about heart. I've noticed that in corporate settings, it resonates more with people when I lead with the mind rather than the heart. But it is, as you say, Jessica, important that those are inseparable. Yeah. So what are the things you do? What do you do on a daily basis, or, once a week or once a month? What are the ways that you keep yourself nourished, that you keep yourself fresh, give yourself energy, or clear your head? Connection with nature. Go into nature daily. Remember to breathe. Fundamentally conscious breathing. I walk my dog in the hills to clear my mind and think creatively. Yes, all of these things. And you just write as many as you can think of what your things are. And in a moment, we'll do a little neuroscience experiment, and I'll explain to you why you do all of those things. Drawing and painting. Wonderful. And so if you have more, just keep adding them. But essentially, baking creatively, great. Not just baking, but baking creatively, wonderful. So every country that I ask this question, and in every field of business, you come up with basically the same list, which is interesting. There's something human in it. And it will usually be things in nature, which we have on here, creative things, baking, knitting, painting, crafts, gardening outside, and then sports. So cycling, walking the dog, running, swimming, these sorts of things. Yeah, there we go. Yoga, laughter yoga. Yes, exactly. All of these things. And there's a reason that we do all of these things. And so what I wanted to look at in our just little bit of time together here is this notion of balancing our mind, heart, and body as the foundation for conscious leadership and human flourishing. It's a component. It's not the only component. And I teach, a year-long course on these things at Oxford. This is one of the sessions, right? But it's also the session that underpins all of the others. So I don't want to say it's the only answer, but I do think it's the foundation of a lot of the other things. Ooh, and someone said swimming in wild waters. Jessica, yes, lovely. Park run on a Saturday morning in the botanical gardens, a long beach walk, bodyboarding, enjoying the waves. Wonderful. Yes, exactly. All of these things. And you see, even when people are writing these things in the chat, people will usually smile while they're writing the things that they do, because it brings us some joy, right? It's something we enjoy. So let's look a little bit. So what we're going to do now is just a little experiment together. Essentially, we're going to be amateur neuroscientists together just for a couple of minutes. And we're going to do a little study. So we'll pause for 2 minutes. And my question to you is if you pause for 2 minutes, if you just give your mind a little bit of a gap where you're not doing anything, what do you notice? So we're not doing a meditation, we're not, we're not doing a particular practice, we're just pausing for 2 minutes and noticing what we notice. Okay, be curious. You can keep your eyes open. I'm going to set a little timer here. And I have to say, don't worry if you fall asleep in the 2 minutes. When I do this in law firms, not joking, within 30 seconds, at least half of the people fall asleep, sitting up in the chair in their office. And then they have an insight that they're tired and they didn't realize, right? So just notice what you notice when you pause for 2 minutes. If you fall asleep, we'll wake you up. Don't worry. And beginning now. Okay. So that was 2 minutes. And if everyone could write in the chat, so that's the end of our study together. I realized I called you amateur neuroscientist, but is anyone actually a neuroscientist before I call you an amateur? No? Okay, good. So as an amateur neuroscientist, we finished our study together. Now we harvest our data. So if everyone could write in the chat at least 3 things that you noticed in those 2 minutes. So we have breathing, body sensations, sounds. Change, freshness of every moment. More marginalized signals came to the fore, sounds, felt sense, and visually I noticed things in the room I hadn't paid much attention to. Yes, very often when I do this in corporate settings, people say, I noticed there's a plant in the corner. We meet in here every day. I never noticed that plant. Yeah. Spacious embodied awareness, thought streams, sensations, the ambient sounds, that I was cold, a sense of mental calm. Ah, great. Okay, wonderful. Ringing in my ears, the sound of my heating, the warmth of the room. This is actually quite a nice poem we've created here. Okay, good. And if you think of more things, feel free to add them. And so what we've just done is two important things. One, we've paused, and this, I think, is really key to human flourishing, is to realize we work with our brains all day. They need us to pause. You know, when we sleep at night, this is a rest time, but as many of you know from different sleep science, Matt Walker and these other people who are writing about this, your brain is doing a lot when you sleep. It's sort of tidying up the house, storing new information, working out what it can get rid of, and so on. So we really need, since this is the tool we're working with all day, we really need moments in the day that we just give our minds a pause, where we're not processing huge amounts of data. It's a bit like, you know, if we walked for a living, if we used our body for a living, we'd have to sit down occasionally, right? You couldn't just walk and walk the whole day. Your body would need you to just every once in a while sit down and pause, right? So the mind needs this too. So that's important to know. And the second important thing that we've done is we've identified two distinct neural modes, so two modes of the brain that we switch back and forth between throughout the day. Now, before I explain that, we'll come back to that in a moment, and we'll come back to this list. So everything that you've written in the list, all of those things fall into one or the other category. All of these things some are your direct experience network, and some are your default mode network. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a moment. But first, I want to explain, why is this important? And this is now, Javon, to your question about the challenges. I was actually going to skip this slide, but since you asked about it, what are the challenges that we're working with in our working life? And so, are people familiar with the term VUCA? Anybody know what it stands for? VUCA? Yes, lots of thumbs up. So it's, I'm told, a military term that is now used frequently in business. And it's a situation that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I had an epiphany about this the other day, which I think I shared with Jessica. If we have time at the end, I'll share it with you. But generally what we need to know in this context is that leading and working in the world today, things are increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And what we tend to find is that the human nervous system tends to have a stress response to this. My epiphany is that it's not inevitable, but it's still the case that it tends to happen for most of us. Okay? And so, it's helpful to think, if you think about your own work that you do, someone in your same position 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, they probably had a vastly different experience day to day than you do. Would you say that's true? What's different today than, let's say, 30 years ago in your own experience? You can use your microphone or chat, whatever you prefer. Less information overload previously. Yes, exactly. More complexity. Yeah. Yeah. Terry.
Computers in our pockets, constantly connected.
Computers in our pockets. Yes, exactly. We did not used to take our work home with us in the same way, right? You left the office and you were gone, right? And maybe someone could call you on the telephone, right? But they couldn't send you 30 emails that they expect to be answered that day, right? Yeah, so there's more complexity. Interesting, less people. Wendy, can you say more about that? Less people? Oh, Wendy's disappeared. Okay, maybe not. Boundaries. Yeah, exactly. So, oh, Wendy's back. Wendy, you wrote less
Yeah.
people.
Thank you, Sophie. Yes, I find that, for example, in the town where I grew up, I remember people greeting one another and waving and knowing one another. And through the years, it's a university town, and through the years, it became so overpopulated that people do not greet one another anymore. They don't know one another. It's just as if they're unfamiliar bodies like populating the town. And when you're a student, yes, then you have your groups, your friends, your activities. And growing up, you also have your friends, but it's not the same. And also the town, seeing how it's like, apart from overpopulation, the buildings, the way that the town has become like smaller in space, in open space, in country, the space that we were used to. So I think, and not only in my situation and in South Africa, but if you look across the world, the population of the people across the world, it makes a difference. And the way we connect on the internet, the way that the actual distance between countries became less because of our connectivity. All those things, yeah, it's, in my view, it's connected.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. So, and from that, I took a couple of points which I think a lot of us experience, which is less human connection, that kind of sense of humanity, community, looking people in the eye and saying hello, that kind of friendliness, so human connection, and then also more densely population, which also means less space, which means less natural space, less nature, more kind of crowding. And of course, that can be also a kind of overwhelm when there are so many. I mean, I take the tube in London a lot, right? It's a lot of people, and nobody looks that pleased with the number of people as they're sort of cramming into the underground. So yeah, some really important points. And Jessica's adding in there, yes, more points of contact, like emails and social media, but less connection. A very good summary. And also to your point, as we work globally, there's a lot more complexity with that. Yeah, thank you. So, and more ultra-processed food and people, Wally says. Yes. Good term, yes. Yeah, exactly. So I think it's, good for all of us to acknowledge, and we can have a sort of self-compassion here. We are working in ways that human beings have never worked before. We're living in ways that human beings have never lived before. If you think about the number of emails, text messages in a corporate environment, it's, on average, if you're a leader, at least 150 emails per day. And then there are Teams messages and Slack messages and WhatsApp and, and people might even call you on the telephone still and all of these things. So our brains have probably never processed this number of words per day. It's a lot of information. And Jessica says, yes, faster food, faster communications, faster transport, and everyone is craving slowing down. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And it's very difficult to slow down when the whole world is speeding up. even when we feel we need it, and even when it makes logical sense. We'll talk a little bit about the neuroscience of that. And then Barbara says, but now we've got greater flexibility, as I describe it, fit for work around your life rather than life around work. Yes. And I think that was, especially with lockdowns, a potential silver lining was realizing, oh, people can work from home, or they can work while they're on holiday, or, in different spaces. Yeah, thank you. And also, and I know if I look at my Oxford students, many of them are looking at more kind of portfolio careers. They want to have a few jobs in which they're independent contractors rather than one salaried job that they expect to be in for 30 years or 40 years. So interesting the way that these things are changing as well. And Barbara says, although I don't like to separate life and work, it's all a part of life. Yes, exactly. And this idea that we can find work and life balance, really it's work and life integration, right? Yeah, thank you. So, from this perspective, and this is to your question, Siobhan, is really one of the biggest challenges to human flourishing is this sense that we're working at a very fast pace. We're processing huge amounts of data. And there's very little spaciousness. There's very little downtime, which means there isn't a lot of time to digest, to reflect on things, and so on. So one of the ways of looking at the effects of this is and this is something I do with leaders, is looking at what this does to the nervous system. Have any of you done any work on the nervous system for yourselves or in your work? Wally has, yes, Barbara, okay, a little bit, Siobhan, Lena, okay. Yeah, so with leaders, I will often do heart rate variability. And I wear like an Aura ring. There are lots of different devices that give you interesting data on when you're in states of stress, or you're just in a state of kind of engagement, when you're in a relaxed state, or when you're in a really restorative deep state. And what we know is that in this context that we just described, this VUCA context and this fast-paced, tons of information context, we're in essentially constant states of activation. So stress isn't necessarily a problem. Pressure isn't necessarily a problem. In fact, if you look at when people are in states of flow, have any of you looked at flow science, or do you do that a bit in your life? Yes, Jessica has, yeah. Yes, quite a few of you. So when we're in states of flow, one of the ways of understanding how human beings go into flow is that if there's a challenge, that it meets your skill set, but maybe it's even higher and it causes you to raise your game a bit, right? There's something that you really get engaged in. And if there isn't enough of a challenge, then you might be a bit kind of bored or disengaged. If the challenge is too high, then it's sort of a bit too much and you go into a state of stress and so on. And probably some of you will say you work well under pressure, or you do great work when there is a deadline. Many people say this. So it's not to say that stress is a problem or pressure is a problem. A healthy nervous system does what this blue line does. We have moments where there's pressure, and then we have moments of restoration. And it's very healthy to almost have this kind of flexibility that you can go back and forth. And essentially, you're putting energy out, and then you're restoring that energy, rebuilding that. You're in activity, you're in rest. But when I do heart rate data with people in corporate working life or in governments as well, especially senior leaders, what their heart rate data looks like is more what you see with this red line. And so essentially what starts to happen is that we wake up and we already have a lot of cortisol, and we kind of jump out of bed and get going. We drink a lot of coffee, which boosts us even more. And then we have right away we open our phone and we see it, we've got 50 new emails that we need to address, and we're kind of going. And then there's a moment maybe where there's a little bit less pressure. But there isn't really a moment where we go down to zero. And then there's another thing, we have to do a presentation or an important meeting, and then we kind of go back up. And so what starts to happen is you start to see nervous systems where the comfort level is being in constant sympathetic nervous system activation. Does that sound familiar, either for yourselves or for people you know in our working world? And so, especially in the corporate world, people say, yeah, I don't want to slow down, I often hear. And do you think, of course, because, and this is a potential takeaway, is that a stressed nervous system seeks more stress. And you might see it in yourself, or it's always easier to see these things in other people. We can see things in other people, and then we can reflect, oh, do I do that too? But you might know someone who seems to almost want things to be stressful. They sort of seek out stressful situations, or when a situation isn't that stressful, they seem to want to up the volume of the stress. Do you know anyone like this? I see people smiling. Yes, okay. And so, what is that? Well, that's a nervous system that has become accustomed to a high level of stress. And so, remember, we function as human beings on autopilot, right? Our systems automate everything that they can, and that's an intelligence of our system because it saves energy, right? So what starts to happen is, instead of having a baseline that is sort of neutral, we get a baseline that is basically sympathetic, and that becomes what feels neutral. And so then if somebody says, maybe you should meditate, right? Or, why don't you take a little break, right? That nervous system actually feels threatened by that. Because this space down here, this space of parasympathetic, is unfamiliar. So we feel uncomfortable being there. And does that make sense? Good, yeah, okay. And so this is where, we get working environments where it's almost like people are kind of feeding off each other's busyness, and any kind of suggestion of, let's see how we can slow this down or build in space. For many people's nervous system, that will be a threat. And they're not conscious that it's a threat, but their nervous system, their survival, the fuel that they're burning is adrenaline and cortisol. And that nervous system needs to essentially learn a different fuel before it can feel comfortable slowing down. I'll just pause there. Does that make sense? Does it resonate? Okay. Okay, so a lot of the work I do in with leaders is starting to understand this. And for many of them, they have this real kind of aha of, yeah, that's why I avoid relaxation, right? Because it feels unfamiliar. And it's almost like the nervous system has lost its flexibility to go back and forth. Okay. So what can we do about this? So it's important to know in working life nowadays, and if we're looking at human flourishing in leadership or conscious leadership, it's important to know relaxation is a skill. It's one of the most important skills that a leader can have today. And it's a skill that most of us haven't been taught, so we're not very good at it. Most leaders are high endurance. They score very high on endurance in these sorts of tests, which means you can work long hours, you can work when you're tired, You can work when you're stressed or ill. You can power through a lot. You're highly resilient. But usually, high endurance people are really weak in the ability to relax and recharge the energy that they have put out. So when we start to re-understand relaxation as a skill, then we realize, oh, in our very thorough education, whether formal education or education through our experience of life, we probably have not had a thorough education, if any education at all, in how to relax. So it makes sense we don't know how to do it very well. So we did our 2-minute study. Now let's look at these two distinct neural modes. So we're coming back to the exercise that we just did. And so the point I want to make here is that in very practical and effective ways, we can learn how to rewire a nervous system that it feels equally comfortable in a restorative state as it does. The nervous system and the brain can learn to be equally comfortable in a restorative state. Okay? But this is rewiring us. Okay. So one way to understand how to do this is with these two distinct neural modes. Okay, so everything that you wrote in the chat, and you can look back to what you observed, falls into one or the other of these categories. Some of those things were the brain's default mode network, and some of those things, and I sometimes call it the narrative network, some of those things were your direct experience network. So remember what you wrote, or have a look. We had things like change, freshness, breathing, body sensations, sounds, things in the room I hadn't paid attention to, spacious embodied awareness, noticing that I was cold, a sense of mental calm, sound of the heating, trying my best to not reflect on the day. Okay. So most of these things fall into one category, but there are a few of the things in here which are the other. Any guesses? Which of these things were your brain's narrative network, and which of them were the direct experience network? What do you think?
I don't mind having a go. Direct experience is probably sensory experience.
Yeah.
And default mode network is probably rumination.
Yes. Well done. A star. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So the direct experience is all of the data that come in through your senses. It's what you see, it's what you hear, it's what you feel in your body. It's the taste of good food, it's seeing a sunset, and so on. The default mode network or narrative network is essentially all of our commentary about that. It's I like this, I don't like this. It's the story of me. It's the kind of blah, blah, blah of your mind. So what we know now from research, and I'm simplifying things a bit here just for the sake of time and what we really need to know about this, is that we tend to have, in our context here today that we just described, we tend to have highly, highly active narrative networks, and then comparatively weak direct experience network. So think about your own experience, or think theoretically. Having a highly active narrative network, how is that potentially problematic? And Jessica asks, are more stressed people more likely to be caught in the default mode network? Essentially, yes, and I'll say more about that. Yeah. Well, essentially because just like a stressed nervous system seeks more stress, and this is another takeaway, an overstimulated brain seeks more stimulation. Yeah. So what's potentially problematic about a highly active narrative network? And you can use your microphone, Terry.
Yeah, I think sometimes, certainly for me, if I listen to it too much, it gets a bit too critical, get that critical inner voice, and then I just end up putting dirty suffering onto clean suffering, if you like. I just make things worse as such, and it just creates more stress sometimes if I listen to my narrative too much because it can get a bit too critical.
Okay, so some really important points there. One, as you say, your thoughts are not facts, right? They might not be representative of reality. The narrative tends to be critical, right? The brain has a negativity bias. We will default towards negative information, right? And so the content of the narrative will tend to be critical, negative, and so on. And then how do we feel, right? Your system, another takeaway, your system does not distinguish between reality and what you're thinking about. So whatever you're playing in your mind, the blah, 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 and you might find, I notice in my meditation practice, I replay the same themes over and over again, right? It's like I have some rerun shows that just keep playing and playing that I apparently love, right? But how do they make me feel? Usually not great because they usually have a negative bias, right? And then I have an emotional reaction to them because that's what our systems do. Yeah. What else? What else is, Barbara?
Yeah, just with the default mode network, of course, we're not conscious of it all the time, and we're not even aware of what we're thinking. The neuroscience says, we think about 60 to 70,000 thoughts every day, most of them negative, most in the past or the future, and most of them the same as yesterday. So, this like blah, blah, blah going on in the head, we're not even aware of it. And it's very evident, when two people are having a conversation and there's a distraction, they come back, what were you talking about? We don't even know, So yeah, it's just a kind of, for me, it's a bit like when you're dreaming, you wake up, you remember the dream, and then you forget it again,
Yeah.
But it's this blah, 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 yeah. It's like not being alive in a way.
Exactly. It's like not being alive because essentially we're missing our life, right?
Yeah,
As you say, if we miss a moment, we space out when someone else is talking or we're doing something, we missed that moment.
Yeah.
If there are a lot of those moments,
Yeah.
we miss the day, we miss our life.
Yeah. And again, this is not the body, there's something wrong with us. It's, it keeps us, it's kept us safe because, our mind should in a way, if you go back to the old part of the brain, it would keep us safe, so we're being distracted by things, so that we can run away if we have to or whatever.
Exactly. There's some really clever survival mechanisms also related to the negativity bias. And the reality is today, those are survival mechanisms that regulate our physical survival when there's a threat to our physical survival. And in this moment of time, in our context here, for the most part, our greatest challenge every day is not staying alive physically, right? Whereas it was for our ancestors. So a lot of those mechanisms that have developed are out of date. And we pay more of a cost for them. But it's a good point to think, oh yeah, but we developed this for a reason. It's not a bad system. And also our ability to think is a great asset to us, as we just said, right? A lot of us, if you're a knowledge worker, you're paid to think. It's also how we self-reflect. And so it's not a system we want to get rid of.
Definitely not.
But maybe one to fine tune, because to your point, Barbara, we are spending a lot of time in the past, in the future, a lot of time spacing out, and we're missing our lives when we're doing that.
Yeah.
We're missing what's happening in the
Yeah.
present. Jessica, did you want to add to that?
I find it fascinating when you introspect on those moments of spacing out. You know, you can, when you look back afterwards, you can really notice how external perceiving has sort of switched off or attention has moved away from it. And we're introspecting, we're looking inward, we're in some kind of a narrative loop. It's amazing how powerful that is. And I'm curious about, you know, we had a session in another program that we're running at Alef Trust only yesterday. We were considering the power of manifestation and how introspection can be such a powerful tool for you know, really focusing on something that you do want to bring into your life, that you want to see, visualizing it internally. You know, as you say, the brain doesn't differentiate between the external and the internal. So when we're reaffirming something that we really want, how that can then also begin to manifest externally. It's so fascinating that this can be a powerful tool, but at the same time also one that's, yeah, getting us caught up in rumination. Yeah.
Exactly. Really powerful tool, and in a sense neutral, right? And it's how we engage with it. And Jim Doty, who's a lovely man, has been writing about manifesting and the neuroscience of it. So his work is really interesting. People want to look at the science of that. Yes, and Jessica's already on it. Yeah, so really good points here, right? So essentially, the narrative network has great virtue. It's the way that we think, it's the way that we self-reflect. It also has the potential to drain our energy. Thinking is not free, right? Another takeaway. Everything you do with your mind has an energetic expense. Your brain uses 20 to 25% of the energy in your body throughout the day. So what are you using that on? It's also, so many people have difficulty sleeping at night. And it's not because their bodies aren't tired, right? It's because someone is still talking, right? And unless you have children, it's you, right? Kind of blah, 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 blah. This happened today. I have to remember to do this tomorrow. And that's keeping us awake. Or maybe you fall asleep, but then you wake up in the night and you've got a kind of narrative going. Right? So what we can learn to do is to regulate this narrative network. And so here comes a big takeaway for you, is if at any moment in your life you want to switch neural modes, you want to turn down, any moment of your life you don't want to be in narrative, you want to turn down that blah, 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 what you do is you activate your direct experience network. If you want to turn down the narrative network, you activate the direct experience network. And what does that mean? Essentially, it means that you come back to your senses. And we even have this term in English and also in many other languages. There's a term like come back to your senses, kind of means come back to reality or be sane or be wise, right? And there's a real practicality to that because the direct experience is always present moment. It's always now. We don't hear the bird song from yesterday. We don't feel in our body that we're warm from tomorrow, right? It's always what is happening now. So it's always present moment. It's not so much our interpretation of things as the reality as it is that we can observe, right, objectively, and we can experience, right, through all of our senses. It's also where a lot of our joy in life comes from. So if we come back to where we started, the list of things that you shared, what are the things you do to give yourself energy, to nourish yourself, to clear your mind, to feel good? And I said I would tell you the neuroscience of why you do those things. Why do you do those things? If you look back to that list, wild swimming, baking, walking the dog, being in nature, yoga, painting, why do you do those things? And you can use your microphone or write in the chat.
It's nice to hear the voices, isn't it? So I would like to encourage you to speak if you. Javon, you're unmuted, so do come on in. And Wendy's got her hand up now as well. I think that's lovely. Yeah.
I think we do these things to lose our minds and to come back to our senses.
Yeah. Yeah. Come back to our senses. Yeah. Oh, yeah. To turn down the narrative. Yeah. Wendy.
Thank you very much. While you were speaking, I was thinking about something I read a while ago when I was busy with a research project. Nassim Taleb, trader turned academic researcher in probability theory, he wrote that dealing with the unknown often requires us to act without understanding everything about the present moment, but to continue doing things well. So that was one thought that crossed my mind while I was listening. But to respond to your question about what we do and why, I think it's to literally come back to our senses and to allow our senses to take over. For example, when I did my research study, I worked in total silence when I was writing. And the moments when I got up to relax, I switched on music to deliberately silence my left brain and to wake up my right brain. And also in line with that, a while ago, I did a workshop with a group of colleagues about overcoming writer's block. Now, we all know that sometimes when we write, we just, without words, we know we have so many ideas in our minds, but just to get those ideas out on paper, the way we see them with our mind's eye, that is sometimes a problem. So what I decided to do is I gave each one of my colleagues, I gave them like a coaster, a piece of wood, but in a square representing that block, the writer's block, but just an empty one. And then I gave each one 16 mosaic tiles, exactly the similar colors. Each one of them had this selection of colors, but same, like packages of colors and glue. And I asked them to paste, to select these mosaic tiles and to paste them onto the coasters. And how strange it was to see all of them struggling to fit in 16 tiles on those blocks. And then suddenly someone said, but we don't need to fit in all these. And then they realized they can only fit in 9 of these 16 tiles, but I deliberately did that the way. And how often we sit with this mass information, and because we love what we do and we're passionate, we want to use everything, but we're not willing to let go of some of the stuff till another time when we can perhaps use it better. And also interesting was the fact that how few people saw the opportunity to work with a pattern or repetition. They all did different things with the tiles. So it was very interesting. I once posted something in Sutra on this exercise with the mosaic, the results. And it was interesting how they responded to this writer's block, but eventually understanding the idea of taking themselves away from what was worrying or stressing them and focusing on something that that was like less familiar, taking their minds away. And when the moment they relaxed and focused on something else, then the ideas returned and they felt more creative.
Thank you, Wendy. It's a good point. And David Rock has done a lot of work on this. If some of you are familiar with his kind of neuroscience in the workplace, and the sense that, yeah, when we relax, when our systems are in a state of parasympathetic, we think more clearly, we have more creative ideas and so on. And people will often say that they have their best ideas when they're in the shower or when they're going for a run. Why? Because they're in direct experience. They're not in a narrative. No, thank you. And Terry had his hand up, and then Wally.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, you were talking about flow experiences earlier when people take on a challenge which meets their skill set. But also, I think, was coming from my research, is that people can experience flow through this direct experience network when they're fully engaged with their senses, because then the default network quietens down. So people have reported to me they experience flow when they're really listening to other people as such, or when they're making things, just tinkering, or when they're in the sauna and they've got their senses are getting overwhelmed, So I think this direct experience network coming to your senses can create flow as well. Just wanted to throw that in.
Absolutely, Terry. Yes, I totally agree. What a good point. Thank you for adding that. Thank you. Yeah, Wally.
Thank you very much. And, my default mode network was activated for the past couple minutes. So one of the insights that came about is how perhaps less enlightened leadership will use their power, perhaps to destroy rules and norms that are conducive or beneficial for flourishing, right? In fact, as a response to the experience of VUCA. Right. So power can actually be used to destroy and annihilate as a way to restore what is experienced as a safety for some, but unfortunately at the expense of others. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and maybe to add to that, I've also seen in unhealthy leadership patterns, this wanting people to be in a bit of a state of stress, or wanting people to be in a kind of constant narrative, because people are a bit disempowered in that state, and I think there's something also, for ourselves to have in mind. I often tell leaders, the most powerful person in the room is the most relaxed person in the room, because their brain will be functioning better, their cognitive abilities are more available to them. And seeing a leader who's extremely kind of stressed, and it's not very inspiring. You sort of feel, and a lot of leaders function in that way. Yeah, so there's something actually quite empowering for ourselves and others to learn to just be with ourselves, be in ourselves, be in a restoration state. Okay, so just for your reference, I just put some of the qualities that you remember of what is the difference between the narrative and the direct experience networks. Okay, and I think the final point here is a real foundation of flourishing in the world today where we are overstimulated. And maybe I'll just pause let's see if I can stop sharing and not now show my email or something. There we go. Okay. Are you just seeing each other and me? Good. Okay. In the world today, where whether we're in a leadership position or not, we're receiving a lot of data, and we're living at a fast pace, and we're living, as you said, with a lot of complexity, less quality, less high quality human interactions, more head, less heart often, and these sorts of things. That some of the more important practices that we can do for our own flourishing are the practices which bring us into direct experience. So when you're looking at your own life and, do I have time for a walk in nature today? It's a really high ROI. It's a really high return on investment. Because not only are you nourishing yourself, but you're giving your brain moments in direct experience, which means that the mind becomes more comfortable with that. Remember, an overstimulated brain will seek more stimulation, right? And this is neuroplasticity. The more that we direct our attention to our direct experience, in a meditation, paying attention to the breath, when Wally's doing his creative cooking and just paying attention to the ingredients and the smells and the tastes and all of that, or if we're just washing the dishes or walking somewhere, the more that we direct our attention to the direct experience, the more that becomes the comfortable place for the mind to rest because it's familiar. We create new neural pathways. And the more that we're in direct experience, the likelihood is the more that our nervous system will also be soothed. So you can also notice the moments that we avoid just being present. I notice sometimes I just sort of reach for my phone suddenly. I don't know if you notice that. I didn't get a call, I didn't get a text message, but I just kind of reach for it and then I do something, right? Those are very interesting moments because there was something happened. Our system wanted stimulation, or we felt uncomfortable and wanted to change that feeling, distract ourselves. So look in those moments when we look for a stimulation or a distraction, and those are great moments. You can go, aha, what am I rejecting in my experience? And do I really need to look at my phone? Not really, right? Probably. And know that every time you choose to come back to the direct experience, you're strengthening these pathways. And that will become the comfortable place for your mind to be. So that's it. Thank you. I think we could have I don't know if we have time for questions, but there was a good discussion. Thank you everyone for contributing, and it's a much richer discussion when we hear from everyone. So thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for having me, Jessica and Terry.
Thank you, Sophie. And I'm just noticing here Barbara's message in the chat window, which is lovely. A quote speaking to the Dalai Lama, and when he was asked what surprised him most about humanity, and he responded, man. Maybe also woman, but maybe man. Not making an interesting point here. No, human. Because they sacrifice their health in order to make money. And then they sacrifice money to recuperate their health. And so they're anxious about the future and they don't enjoy the present. And the result being that they do not live in the present or in the future. They live as if they never are going to die and then die never having really lived. Such an important point, isn't it? Yes.
Thank you, Barbara.
And thank you, Sophie, for today. The time has flown, and it's been a lovely session with you. Thank you very much for weaving this narrative for us and introducing us to a little bit of cognitive neuroscience. I think that was most welcome. We are coming up to time, so I will just close by mentioning that we have a webinar coming up. Our next one is on the 11th of March. With Zoe Walters. She will be exploring, Zoe has a background in human resources, and she'll be exploring specifically how human resource managers can lead in a development and draw from transpersonal psychology to transform workplaces. So I think this will be a really interesting session as well. Sophie, again, I'm really grateful that you joined us today. And if there is a website or some other resource that you want us to direct us towards, feel free to pop it into the chat window now. But also, if you want to share it later by email, then we can also circulate that to our network. So to make people aware of the work that you're doing and any publications that you feel you would like to share. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I will email you. And thank you again so much for having me. And I think it's a wonderful project that you're creating here. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we'll close the room. Feel free to unmute and say goodbye, and we'll see you in the next session. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.